we were able to collect a lot of data on the act of learning. There are schools in China, these experiments, you wouldn't be allowed to do them in these countries, but they are being noted to see, oh, is the air quality good? Is there a difference? Is the light and oxygen? So this data was even more valuable than any of us had ever thought. The more interesting thing was that there were signals in physical motions, their eye movements, those spaces between acting, that were very good indicators of what we call what was the next action going to be. And here's a good example of multimodal. Infinitely easier for you to learn a song in French, than it is to learn French.
Robert Hardman, pleasure to have you here.
My pleasure. Good afternoon.
You've been working on something extremely fascinating, and I think this is a good place to begin as a follow-up from where we've had discussions before. Efficiency by understanding the brain.
Yes, I think my background is a physicist, but I've been heavily involved in what I called applying AI, and I've had the privilege to be able to use it both as a tool, but also we were looking at examining how do children learn, and from that a number of specific things on how the brain learns, and it became very obvious that children learn socially together. And so we were able to collect a lot of data on the act of learning. And so that was one thing we put aside. And when I mean the act of learning, what we found was it wasn't just I got 5 out of 10 in a test or memory. What we really found was the act of them carrying out the test. In many of the tests, it was multi-choice or click on this and click on that. Well, what was interesting in the signals was we observed them, we observed their physical motion, we were able to get sometimes haptic feedback from when they had to point on things, we were able to observe eye movement. And when you looked at all of this, what you found was that there was more information on the learning process, not on just that they marked B or got A right, but the actual physical actions of when they pressed A or B, the time it took between, those spaces between the activity and watching their body motion. And when you looked at that, combined with the results, the more interesting thing was that there were signals in their physical motions, their eye movements, those spaces between acting, that were very good indicators of what we call what was the next action going to be. So that was a really interesting thing. So from that, we decided to make tests that were done without them knowing it was a test. For instance, to log on to the system would make a puzzle, and they would have to go, oh, my login is going to be mouse, bear. They could have some animals or simple things, and they knew that, oh, I'd hit this sequence to log on. And then watching them and how efficient they were at finding those patterns, because we changed the patterns. And so they weren't thinking about it as an exercise, it was just to log onto the system. So by capturing their subconscious activities was a different window onto their activity.
So how has that evolved into taking that insight into applying that into a very technical sense?
What it really showed, and again, a lot of the information was, I think the word now people use is multimodal. And here's a good example of multimodal. It is infinitely easier for you to learn a song in French, Frérot Jacques, than it is to learn French.
That's very true. Yeah.
You'll pronounce it correctly and you'll learn it. It is easier to learn a poem than it is free text. Now, that is multimodal to me because one has rhythm, that's why a poem works. And I can remember poems, why, going back to when I was, 10, 12 years old. The brain is so good at combining those things to imprint it.
Like Twinkle, Twinkle,
Yeah.
Little Star. That it's the rhythm of it. It's a completely different pattern that you're looking at.
And that's why, that's an example of the modes working together. And that's why we have poems and nursery rhymes and things like that, because that's how children learn and embed. And so if you take that sort of concept and ramp it up to adulthood and, say, okay, I can get the people to learn by involving sound, with reading or physical touch or haptic feedback. The key thing is that you engage multiple senses. And it goes back to a previous discussion we're having, when we're saying the brain is optimized, for the principle of least action. It wants to have the least amount of energy to do it. And if you have two different signals coming in, so the ear and the eye, the way it can integrate those signals mean it can use less information to pull out that signal. So obviously evolution is making that a key component. So the ability for the brain to process two modes, to look for that difference, to remove noise, etc., is so much more efficient than one mode. So it's always going to be something that is optimized, and that can then lead to how you build neural networks and such. You can start to model that concept of, if I take different types of inputs and then integrate them in a certain way. So it leads to making more neural networks that model aspects of the brain better. And therefore those neural networks will be better than the simple back propagation networks we have now.
Well, it's interesting because our passion and our view of the technology that I've been developing for a decade now, the weight and importance of observational elements, and as could be described as multimodal, the ability to constantly be observing and assessing. There's something going on in the background, the brain, but the digital equivalent of that, if you've just taken a pre-trained model and you're interacting within a static context, then that obviously has massive limitations. But the concept of continuous learning, I just don't see how a lot of the existing AI incorporates or understands or considers that, which is a fundamental flaw.
Yeah, no, that's very true. And I think most people working in the field understands that the sort of models they've got are modeling a very small component of it. And their universe is very narrow. The palette that they can choose from to solve the problem. We know the brain is plastic. It reorganizes itself. We know that, as I mentioned earlier, it sits in an electric field. And here's an important part, and why I said emphasize the word field. A field is continuous.
Precisely.
And if I was modeling a field, I would create an analog computer. And they have analog computers. And that is a better model of the brain than the digital. An analog computer will not give you the same answer for the same input. It will always be slightly different.
Because it's a constant variable,
Yes,
isn't it?
it could be using an inductor and a resistor. So you build these analog computers and they're brilliant, but unlike digital, they won't give you pi to 3.14%. They'll give you an approximation very quickly. And that's so you can see that the brain uses this analog approach, and this allows this natural variation of things will not be the same even with the same input.
But even if you consider the world in which we live, I mean, yeah, I've raised it a few times on recent podcasts. And again, it's just an observational viewpoint that I have with the laws in which we exist. And if we're trying to create AI capable of being artificially intelligent, as the term would be, then surely we have to be cognizant and live within a structure of the rules, such as the laws of physics. Gravity exists. We don't consider huge amounts of data points, but even, is the AC on? Is it off? Are we wearing clothes which were a bit cold? We're constantly considering temperature. And again, all of the senses. Is it too light? Is it too dark? Everything that we experience every single day whilst alive is a massive amount of consideration. But that's almost not considered the majority of the time, which seems a bit crazy to me.
Yes. There are schools in China, and that where they were checking the rooms, measuring the oxygen content and the light. These experiments, you wouldn't be allowed to do them in these countries, but they are being noted to see, is the air quality good? Is there a difference? Is the light and oxygen? So people are sort of realizing that, especially when the brain is changing, like I said, when you're 3, you're a completely different person. When you're 4, you're another different person. When you're 5, there's that age where the brain is changing. They're virtually different human beings. The physical changes in the person make a difference. The ear is a different shape when you're young, so they will hear higher frequencies only, or in a different manner. It's designed evolutionarily to listen to the mother's voice. And so also their taste buds, as I think I mentioned before.
We discussed this.
Yeah.
This was fascinating.
So the physical laws of that little human being is different to when they're our size, and that needs to be taken into account. And what's interesting is the speed that we learn, when you're young, is extremely fast. Not only is the brain changing, but the physical nature, the vocal cords, the ears, the taste buds, the senses, all these things are changing at the period where we're growing and learning the most. So that sort of says change must be really important.
It's fundamental.
It's fundamental.
And it's constant. It's always fluid and fluctuating. I mean, it explains why I always hated Brussels sprouts. I haven't touched them for years because in my mind I still hate them. I probably actually do, but maybe they don't taste as bad as they used to. But that constant fluid changing environment, the power to observe what is happening around us. I mean, this is why we have this blue. We have it blue because we understand that from a human eye perspective, you can have longer sustained periods of concentration with the right light settings. I mean, we literally filmed something here with Muhammad Ali Jr., Muhammad Ali's son, and we tried a kind of dark orange, red. It was very moody. He was tired, but within 10 minutes, he literally was falling asleep whilst talking and fell asleep and started snoring. Lovely man, but we realized we can influence the physical conditions. We also made it very warm. It's quite cool in here now because it's optimal conditions. But all of these considerations have to be mapped, understood. And if we can observe and think in the right way, it's incredible what potentially can be done. I mean, this kind of brings on to opening up your experience. And I've mentioned Richard Feynman as one of my favorite people to have lived. Give us an insight because you experienced being taught by him.
I was very lucky in that I was able to get some lectures in quantum electrodynamics from Richard Feynman himself. And I think my takeaway was, first of all, what a fascinating storyteller. He taught physics through story and narrative. He was very physically active. You can go see the Feynman lectures on YouTube and he's dancing, basically. The amount of physical action. and the way he uses his voice. And all these things are brought together to describe exceptionally weird and complex physics with, very complicated mathematics. But within this narrative, he's bombarding you with movement, voice, explanations, and a wonderful narrative that just brought you in. And for some reason, it's like he's taken away the clamps on your brain, and you start to understand things that would normally have been, 6 hours in the library looking at a textbook and still not getting it. But I do think the lecture was a performance that opened yourself up to the actual content that he was delivering in it. So if he'd done it just sitting there and standing and talking, I think it'd be not as effective. So it was that performance that allowed you to learn.
But that's a fascinating, again, observation to understand, well, if that is the case and what made him an incredible communicator, then we can adopt that. I mean, also for context, because many people maybe don't know who he is, what did he do? What was so significant about him with his achievements during his life?
He worked on the Manhattan Project first as a very junior physicist with Oppenheimer. He was renowned for being naughty, just because he was a magician, and he was also an excellent safecracker. And he got in trouble because he just wanted to prove that he could break in and open the safe of where all the secret documents were, which he did. And you can imagine, the military don't have the best sense of humor. The fact that their best security, he was able to go in and get it out. So he was a prankster like that. He was well known for playing bongo drums and being the equivalent of a 1950s hippie, a mod, sort of type thing. Well read.
The NASA
Oh
situation.
yes, when the space shuttle unfortunately blew up, he was called in to solve the problem. Because there's billions of parts of that, and of course, again, his clarity of mind, his logic solving. He was able to do that. He was a brilliant physicist. He got the Nobel Prize for coming up with what's called, you'll hear a thing called quantum diagrams or Feynman diagrams, which are ways of representing particle and energy reactions. That goes along with a whole bunch of complicated mathematics, but this Feynman algebra allows mere mortals like ourselves to handle this mathematics in a much more reasonable way to get to answers. So yeah, and he just had an energy about him, but a sharp mind, and it would apply to any problem, not just physics.
And I think this is an important point, because you've gone on to do some remarkable things. And when people say, well, what do you do? So the question is typically constrained by an expectation of, let's say, normality. You're an accountant, or you're this, or you're that. Labels, which is something I personally detest, labeling everything and putting people into boxes. Critical thinking, freedom of thought, problem solving. A problem can be solved with a way of thinking across any spectrum. So give us a little journey of where you began, and begin to touch on the problems that you have been involved in solving that everyone would know, but they don't know.
Okay. When people ask what you do, again, like you, I find it irritating. I'm a problem solver, and anything can interest me. It's like, oh, my background in education, which I was lucky was very broad. It's given me a palette that's bigger than the palette that most people have. So I can choose all sorts of solutions from this palette, which gives me a certain advantage. But I can apply that palette to any type of problem. Logic remains the same. Humans are the same. People behave the same. You soon, if you have the luxury to be well read, you can read things written 2,000 years ago, and they could have been written today. You realize, okay, so humans haven't changed.
Well, Archimedes, for
Yeah,
example.
you read Cicero, it's good and it's bad. But it really, you realize there are certain things that drives people, and they haven't changed, and they're good and the bad, and that's a very useful thing to realize. Before, when we were talking about the brain activity and all that, one of the things and a dimension that isn't of taken into account much, but again needs to be, and the way I look at it is, and I've always been puzzled by emotions. So what are these annoying things, emotions? It's like, it doesn't make any sense to me logically. Why is evolution giving us emotions? It's not efficient. It's, and then I realized, I said, oh, if I was an insect, we'd give up pheromones, right? But emotions are how we couple to our social environment. And because we're social creatures, and I was always wondering, and if you watch a child, they will imitate what they watch. And emotions at their basic level, I've observed, is how we've coupled, how I couple to you, a group of people around me, and that's the emotions. Now they can go haywire.
So it's an alignment of energy.
Yeah. And there's a reason why we have emotions, and it's this ability so we can couple, align with our social things around us. We can't do it through electromagnetism or any of that sort of thing. So emotions are a method how we signal to each other. And it's really sort of weird. And unfortunately, it can go really wild and go off, but that's an important part of how we learn and our brain, and it's that social thing. So like you were saying, we mustn't leave out all the ways we interact with our environment, but emotions are part of that thing, because emotions are the way we socially interact. You smile, I'll smile. I'm happy, or I feel your emotions. That's the way yeah, that's the way evolution has allowed social groups to exist. Like I said, it works well when it works well, but it can, we're a biological system.
But it can be weaponized as well.
Very much so. And I'll go back into, remind me to go back to that point in some of the things. But you're saying the sorts of problems, the jobs work I've had, I've been very lucky in that they have been based on, rather than being an accountant, we have a problem. Can you work out how to solve it? A lot of the problems have always had a large technology component, and that's just through the nature of the world and business. And so I developed an expertise in everything from hardware, chip manufacture, all the way up to building data centers. And that ability to go, oh, there's a data center, how should I design it? Well, if you understand how you design a chip, how the chip fits into a computer, what needs the computer with storage, all the way down to how do you generate the electricity to go to the data center. Because a data center, for instance, there's only one thing that makes it profitable, and it's its power consumption. And there's a number called PUE, and we did modeling on that, and everything else, nothing counts. It's purely on how much electricity does it use. And so the amount of energy that it can actually efficiently use on a chip to do a transaction, that's the one thing that will tell you, will that data center be profitable or not? And so the efficiency of cooling and all those sorts of things.
And I didn't realize until more recently, but it makes sense. If I'm correct, the laws of thermodynamics mean that if the temperature of the thing you're looking to cool, let's say is 300 degrees, so long as the body around it, the liquid, the cooling, whatever, is less than that, it could be 298 degrees, and there will be energy transfer to create cooling. So I always imagined you'd need really cold water, but that's not the
No,
case.
it's just that difference. As long as there's a difference.
So again, physics comes into play.
Yeah.
And it's really just understanding the world in which that operates. And if you do need a core temperature in general, never mind the cooling, and you're building it in Saudi Arabia, there's different conditions and circumstances to if you're building it in the north of Norway, for example.
Yeah, and it's a fascinating science in itself, um, and it relates to all sorts of things now. There's so much of our processing is done behind the scenes in these data centers that are using a huge proportion of the amount of energy that the planet produces. You can extrapolate and go, we'll be using 30% of the Earth's energy just to do our ChatGPT and AI.
I mean, the key points which I think are important to kind of connect the dots a bit here. So something like that using a huge amount of energy, that's been the case for a long time. Our world, the world of finance, social media world, all digital communications. I mean, if you took off power, and we've seen what it's like when there's a power cut, the world stops. I mean, recently there was a major power cut in Spain and Portugal. But I'm aware from previous business we've done in the US that what happens when you have a supermarket, even a pharmacy, and you have refrigerated stock. And I think one particular pharmacy chain, one of the biggest in the United States, after a certain number of hours, if that refrigerated unit, on average carrying $1 million of stock, is not refrigerated, all that stock must be destroyed. And it was a matter of hours. And you think, well, we've got backup generators. Right, so it'll be fine. And usually when there's a hurricane, the grid is taken out for days. But then did somebody remember to buy diesel and have it? Suddenly there's this cascade of issues, and the world just doesn't operate.
Yeah.
Now, our future, there's more and more and more data. There's more and more demand for it. There is going to be the natural law of efficiency coming, but there's efficiency versus scale, and more dependency, especially as, I mean, I think we probably both would agree the term AI is a loose term at best.
Very loose term.
Yeah. But we can see the component parts of where the world is heading. And these are problems. There is an elevation in temperatures, and humans can debate the cause, but the metrics show things are getting hot. And we notice with one of the clients we've worked with selling ice cubes. So selling ice cubes, the landscape has changed across Europe. And the key thing is humans behave very differently in Spain and Germany. When I think in Spain it's around 28 degrees centigrade, and in Germany when it's 26 degrees centigrade. Now, empirically, mathematically, you can look back over the last decade and say, in Berlin, how many days has it been above 26 degrees concurrently for a period of time? And Spain was hot. It's still hot. It'll be hot. Germany wasn't. So there's a 3,000% increase in sales when those conditions are met. But we're really talking about a situation where that optimal circumstance, from one perspective, happened 3 times a year. Now it's happening 56 times a year. So if you looked at it on the kind of private equity model of, we'll do our forecasting based upon 20% increase year on year. Well, you're already hundreds and hundreds of percentages out. Therefore, the entire supply chain, your manufacturing, everything goes out the window. And really the key driver is, how do people behave when they're a little hot?
Yeah.
Hugely differently.
Yeah, it's like you said, it's very non-linear. People are squishy things, and they behave, and they're very important things to understand. I mean, it's a very complicated system. Going back to what you were saying about power data centers, big data centers we've had to build, etc. We've got to make it availability 99.99999% available, which means you need backups for the backups for the backups.
I've seen the SLAs.
Yeah, and so they go, oh, look, we've got our backups, but where are your backups for your backups? And where are the backups for those? And, I've run some of these places, and, that one's gone, and then that one doesn't go. And, these chains of events do happen. So being able to measure risk correctly and then see what its effect is, it's not done very well. This is where AI tools and that could be exceptionally helpful in quantifying the risk. Humans are terrible,
But it's observing.
scaling.
Again, the key element there, I mean, the protocol is, first off, observe continuously. I mean, the one group that we work with, I'm not going to name who it is at this point, but we'll observe thousands of locations and we'll assess the risk, and we will consider what resilience looks like. And resilience is effectively, even if the bad things happen, if you're resilient, it doesn't affect you. So you've had some consideration. But of course, every place in the world is different. They have different conditions. Now, a human could look at it, and we calculated on average, if one person looked at one location, it would take them 3 months. It'd be out of date by the time they did it. And to do what they need to do would be the equivalent of having a huge team working 58 man years per. I mean, you couldn't do that per year. It doesn't make any sense. The cost would be astronomical. So by understanding how to observe everything, put it into context in real time from a resilience standpoint, and understand the fluidity, the change of everything, well, then you can be doing 58 man years worth of work per minute. Yeah. And that means it's extremely efficient. It moves on to a topic of, is it replacing people's jobs? Well, there are so many things in life and business that currently are running at near zero optimal performance, mistakes being made, opportunities lost. We assume in many ways that the world is this place that kind of works and it's all good and it's taken care of. But we both know, look behind the scenes, the reality is we have incredible efficiencies yet to gain without worrying about replacing necessarily all humans. But it comes back to the humans being able to understand, to think correctly. But as I say, this is why I love Richard Feynman's way of thinking, to communicate, to assess, to observe, and then to make decisions on kind of subject matter expertise.
I mean, again, I'm rambling around here, but when I work or creating, and I build data science teams and AI teams and working with the really, brightest of the bright, and I think I'd say the key thing is not knowing the answer, but knowing what question to ask. And you often see them solving the wrong questions, and they do it really well, but that's not the right question. And the ability to ask the right question, getting the answer becomes, oh, well, that's easy. I've got all these tools that help me do it. But getting that right question, that's a key point. In the future, we'll say, again, I'll use the label AI, but we'll just say analytic tools, etc., help us get to the answer. But if we haven't got the right question, you solved the wrong problem. That's it.
I mean, if you're hungry, you don't say, what's my favorite color?
Yeah.
But that's often, if there's the other side from a psychological thing, where if you say it like you believe it, it could be true. And it's a little mental segue into, and I've mentioned this on the podcast before, if you ask 1,000 people a question and 1,000 people give you the same answer, does that mean that answer is correct? Or does it mean 1,000 people think the same thing with no foundational basis, rationale, or understanding of the topic?
Yeah.
And there's a conflation between what is true and what is popular.
Yeah, it's that argument by authority. Well, they said it.
The Dunning-Kruger effect, effectively.
Yeah.
And it seems to be a symptom of ChatGPT. This is without even going into hallucinations. Yeah. Obviously, we understand from the black box transformer-based model that it has incredible capabilities. It's very smart. There's no doubt about that. But if it is sold as something far more advanced and capable, without anybody validating or understanding, well, how is it working and what is it actually capable of, then the results, if plausible, for the, I don't want to say non-educated because that's patronizing, but non-aware. But how many people are actually aware of how these things work? And why would people be aware when this is all a new technology in the public consciousness?
Yeah, well, people are driven by convenience. If it's,
It goes back to your original point.
yeah, and if it's right once, will be right twice then. That'll save me. And you don't think, the mind that always questions, and that's what you can sort of say, well, don't believe anything, be it ChatGPT or the person standing next to you. Always have the, to be cynical, but not to be rude. Always, now we don't have time, so we naturally just take approximations. Oh, they'll do. Yeah, the bus will come at this time. But there are certain critical things in life where you've got to examine the answer, and you do have to take an extra question. I mean, there's two ways that let me say three ways that we move forward. At the end of the 20th century, when the physics was all done, everybody thought it was all done. It wasn't until there was new data that went, oh, it's not working. Right? Now, if that wasn't there, then there was no one was going to ask any extra questions. But all of a sudden, there was data that said, oh, it's not quite working. And then some people decided to ask a question that they wouldn't have asked unless they realized that something was wrong. And that then led to quantum mechanics.
Was some of that to do with CERN?
Well, this was way back 1890s, etc., when they had what they called the ultraviolet catastrophe, which was, why is it, everything was fitting lovely in physics, but then this one experiment, and then there was a second experiment, which was Michelson and Morley experiment, where they wanted to prove that there was an ether that the Earth was going through, and then they did the measurement, and there was no ether. So it's when things don't work that new questions arise, and from that, things change.
Yeah, that's why I think, again, psychologically, human beings they kind of love negativity in a way, but they don't want to be deemed to be negative. So to look at what is, and again, that means removing emotion and being honest about your observation and being welcoming the things that don't work. I mean, we discussed it. You've met some of our music guys. The approach has been from day one and has always been with artists I've worked with. We won't be complimentary. We won't talk about the nice things. We will talk about what doesn't work and look at where the problems are. And the moment you can play something and I have nothing to say, then it is great, because then there are no more problems left. And by proxy of addressing the problems, it's what you learn around it. Why is it a problem? Why does it not work? Okay, well, what's the definition of what does work? Well, I haven't found it yet, but we know that doesn't work. So keep going, keep going, keep going. You go, now that works. Okay, so out of 5 things that you've done, you can see what is, by saying what works, how does the audience respond? Are you keeping the rhythm? Does it deliver emotion? Does it invoke emotion? There are all of these fundamental factors. And when you put all of these lessons together, if it works, it works. Yeah. It's like if you're happy, you're happy. It's an undeniable state. It's subject to change because no one's ever happy all the time. I mean, possibly chemically induced, but that's kind of cheating. But still, it's welcoming all of those elements. That's where innovation comes from.
Yes, I think the common thread that you've been discussing and other things, and we keep talking about it without directly facing it, is the word change.
Well, the fear of change is the big thing.
And that's the thing that drives everything. If things were the same, nothing would change. Literally, it would be,
But everything is changing around us.
yeah.
And it's almost a denial of that. Only even on an hourly basis. 12 at night is not the same as 12 midday. And our behaviors change accordingly. We go to sleep. There are these different states. So if there's a denial of the observation of all of these things, then it's creating a complete false economy when problem solving.
Yeah, you do. I'll give an example, which was in Silicon Valley, where the problem was to find a signal amongst an awful over petabytes of data. And the question was nebulous because it wasn't direct one. It was basically, can you find anything interesting or anything untoward that's happening? And it was that level of question.
And so let's not name the company, but it's something that shook the world. It was a huge shift and had massive repercussions. I saw part of it in Trinidad, where a part of the journey had occurred. So I'm familiar of the repercussions, but it also actually really changed world events.
Yes, and it opened a window onto what has been happening because there wasn't oversight. And it was new and people didn't even know these things would happen and could ask it. But what it came down to was vast amounts of data, and this is now common amongst everywhere you look. We all leave trails of our data lying around, but there are companies that by their nature or indirectly hoover up all this data, and they don't do it for free. And there's a lot of money involved in hoovering up the data. And one only has to go back to a quote from Cicero, "Cui bono," who benefits? They're not doing it for love. And so the problem was, we know something untoward could be happening. Here's petabytes of data. Good luck, go for it. Can you find any patterns in there that should not be there? So again, what we looked for, it was an exceptionally tricky problem, not just the volume, but again, and the way we found the signal was looking for changes, very subtle changes in this vast amounts of data. In mathematical terms, we looked at it in a spatial frequency type thing. Because if you looked at the data just normally looking at it, there was nothing. It was such a random sort of mess. But by applying quite complex mathematical techniques that looked at spatial characteristics of the data in frequency terms, we were able to tease out signals, and those signals were able to be tracked down to certain organizations or people's behavior that were inside the data. And we were able to link those signals to bad actors. We were able to link them to North Korea, to Russia. The hardest one was to Mossad, and every Tom, Dick, and Harry was in there in the data. So, I won't say they were all good and bad, but there was a lot going on in there. But once we'd teased out how to see these signals, we realized that this data was even more valuable than any of us had ever thought. And that there was a reason why these people were paying for access to the data. And then we could track that access to see, what it led to.
And just to kind of give a bit of context, the beneficiaries were able to exert influence on human behavior.
Oh, yes.
Ultimately.
Yeah. I mean, as we started to pull on the threads, you could see that this isn't a passive activity. Okay, it's responsive. So in a sense, the ecosystem was a giant experiment, and there wasn't any control, and different actors were going, oh, let's try doing X on this and see what happens. Do we move the dial? I can't say it was just that country or that person. There were a number of actors. Some countries, some companies were all interacting with this ecosystem directly or indirectly, which was surprising. But the effects were going from affecting, political events, affecting elections, changing the mood, or that, bringing out, shall we say, politics of the far right or the far left and amplifying them.
But again, it goes back to a point that you touched on before. What would happen if you could harness emotions and invigorate anger, and how are people effectively connecting? They're matching their emotions.
Yeah.
So if you can amplify people's emotions and connect them with people experiencing the same emotions, and then create echo chambers and fuel a narrative.
That's exactly, yeah. That was it. They were creating these self-contained ecosystems where they, as a laser works, it just amplifies itself.
Which can then be weaponized.
Yes. And we can see the results of it today in terms of the many echo chambers that we have, and how easy it is to rile up a crowd or for whatever movement, good or bad,
Which goes back to putting people into boxes as such. It's almost, if you can control the organization, then you can influence, and then, I mean, not everyone's doing things for nefarious purposes, but the result is the same. And I think this is a good way to say the evolution of this, because if we say AI and where it's headed, and we get the perception that it is new. I mean, we know from Professor Sharples, he's working on Gen AI in 1978.
Yeah.
Right? We know that the original advanced systems, I forget the terminology, in and around the time of the original Star Wars project, and people got a bit worried. I mean, films like Terminator and Skynet and that came about, and that was just rebranded. So it was rebranded as such and became, the credit scoring systems. So the idea that AI is new with ChatGPT is not necessarily factually accurate. So if we assumed the public perception of AI is 18 months, 2 years old at this point now, we do have a long pathway, if you zoom out a little bit, that things are already progressing, but additional, let's say, evolved capabilities. So the circumstance that you've talked about, that evolved capability via kind of the chat GBTs and the attack vectors. So what you've just been discussing, you can put an attack vector on anything in effect. And we've talked about the experimentation where we've created an alternative truth in and around one of the people here that we work with. We're able to undo it. But if you're willing to, you can change what the perception of reality is as far as what comes out the other end. And it can be done. Now, it's probably far easier and on an international level to do this now with the new iterations of publicly accessible AI, which has also bled into the enterprise world, the business world, significantly easier and on a much grander scale than it was with the circumstance you're talking about, which was bad enough as it was, because it did change the outcomes of numerous things in the world.
Very much so. I mean, Whoever controls the data, that's the oil of today. And these models learn on data and the biases, and because they're black boxes, and then because they're convenient, and humans love convenience. They like their mobile phones because they're convenient. AI as it presented is so convenient. It's like, oh, could I think, or should I just ask the question?
Well, you mentioned before to me the ride-sharing company. We won't name names. So give us an example of what you did there, because that sounds...
Yeah, I mean, that was an interesting one. They wanted to know where, if they electrified their fleet, where they'd need to put charging points and how much charging, and so where their fleet was. And my first question was, well, don't you know where they are? So it's your fleet, that was a sort of first question. And apparently it wasn't as easy as they thought. But when we did do the analysis of where the drivers were, and that, it was nothing like what common sense and what the business thought. We thought, okay, this is the city, this is all the workers finish at 5 o'clock. Here are the main points, big stations, I'll be there. That's where the drivers will probably be. We'll put the chargers there, etc., and places like that. Well, what it found out to be was drivers are human, and they're very clever. And they'd worked out that if they hung out in Mayfair or Regent's Park, even if they missed 10 rides, one ride from Regent's Park would give them a bigger tip than 5 rides from anywhere else. So they all would hang around the place where they would get the biggest tips, rather than where most of the journeys and traffic was going from. Purely human once you'd uncovered it.
Because the splits ended up, again, without naming the company, more like 48% to the company and only 52% for the driver. So at which point, and if they're kind of downgrading some of the job values, a tip's probably worth 4 jobs.
Yeah. Oh yeah, and these people were very generous with their tips from those places. So it was, even I was shocked at the sorts of so some of them were eye-watering, but this was natural. The drivers had worked this out amongst themselves and had come up with their own rules of where to behave, which was completely different to what the business and sort of common sense would sort of say. I mean, again, the data gave it away. Another example of this, which I just find amusing, so I'll tell. In an island in the Caribbean, they wanted to carry, a census. They wanted to know where people really were, so they knew where to build hospitals and schools. And it's really important, the census, right? But for some reason in the Caribbean, they didn't like filling out the census forms, and the data was always sort of wrong. So what we did, we knew, well, everyone owns a mobile phone. So we decided that at 4 in.m, where that phone existed, was the address of where that person was, probably, for most cases.
Yeah, statistically most likely.
Yeah, most of them, some people were. So again, that was so different to what the official census information was. So by counting people correctly, so saying, okay, that's the 4 a.m, that's, we do that every night, and that seems to be the address of, X number of people, gave quite a different map of what the official census was saying. Again, just a different way of looking at what it says is, again, without knowing it, we leave a digital wake, and organizations, for good or for bad, if they're clever enough, can extract that digital wake and make valuable decisions on it. In this case, it was great. It improved where the government was going to, decide to build hospitals and schools, because it was a far more accurate of where people actually really lived, as opposed to what they were saying.
And sometimes it doesn't take too much data. I mean, yesterday I was doing another second round of courses with students at the London School of Economics. And the data that we've given them is actually publicly available data in one sense, a tiny bit of data from another, which technically is publicly available and some anonymized basic figures. And to geospatially match them, you can see from very simple data, but if you understand the context, you can see populations going on holiday.
Yeah.
You can see where they move. And the interest or the context is products that our customer will sell, and when will they sell, how much will they sell, where should they be placing their product at any point in the time of the year. And if you just looked at the day of the week, for example, Mondays people don't behave like they do on a Friday. It doesn't sound stupid because it's quite obvious. So sales would be terrible on a Monday and Tuesday, even if all other conditions are met. But at Easter, then forget it, because no one's there. Well, where did they go? Well, you could see where they went. So if you have enough just little points dotted around, base data, suddenly you see all of these different things. You see sporting events, all this behavior is revealed, and
it's exceptionally valuable. And just another dumb example like that, when Boris bikes first came out, the problem was they had to pick up bikes from A and then put them in a truck and take them to B, etc. And it's like, is there a way of improving that? Where will people be? And we modeled that, and what we found, you could tell, was I included meteorological data, daily weather data. So you could see when it started to rain in the West London, and as those showers moved over, its impact on where bikes were being dropped off and left. And that made a huge difference. So again, linking, people say, why are you looking at meteorological data? Well, I just thought I'd see if we can combine it. And there the signal popped out. You could tell, okay, the rain's there, that shower's going to take so long to move over, and therefore the bike's going to be left there in half an hour, the shower's going to be there in an hour's time.
It makes a huge difference. We spent a decade working originally around meteorological data. It affects everything.
Yeah.
But because we're in it, it's like the fish in the goldfish bowl saying, where's the water? It is in which we live, and it affects everything.
And now that we have the processing power to use that data, it's sinful not to, because like you said, it uncovers things that you become obvious when it's uncovered, but when you're looking at it, it's like, oh, so.
It makes me think of discussions we've had with Professor Song, and you will meet him at some point soon. If what has happened and the definition of the DeepSeek moment. So if we look at processing power and we look at resources and you look at the origins of, or the last couple of years, few years, with the big companies that have had billions and billions and billions to train models, iterate, the asset and the resource, the NVIDIA graphics cards, well, they had a sufficient amount, but in China they couldn't get them. I'm sure there were ways to get around some, but the problem was, how do you solve a problem without the resources and without the budgets as such? And that limitation, mostly in life, limitations lead to creating efficiency and doing something. Even if you're pushed to the extreme, you'll probably get extremely good results. So in many ways, that proved the trajectory of where things are going to go, to do with specifically efficiency, of creating next generation artificial intelligence components.
Oh yeah, we know, and I think the industry will tell you that we'll call it the current popular ecosystem is exceptionally effective at doing lots of simple things for people. So it's not that it's no, but it has a limit. It's not the next generation. We know the next generation of things needs that sort of what we're talking about, dynamic. It needs to be able to change. It's not that flat neural network.
Fluid observational.
Yes, and there's a thing called fluid neural networks. So they're starting to look at it. So what we do is building in that those connections can dynamically rearrange, like the brain does, reconfigure. So it's not just change the weights of these; it's change the whole thing. And I think
based on inputs, which if we consider eyes an input, ears an input, touch an input, even skin. I mean, skin as an organ, it's a massive measuring device. It's measuring humidity. It's measuring all manner of different things that we just think, oh, it feels a bit humid and warm today. Well, actually, that's a lot of different data that you've just pulled in, and you're looking for change. Getting hotter, getting colder.
Oh yeah, I mean that's like I said, it's the biggest organ on it. So we are a bunch of sensors, and so the next generation of neural network technology, and I think the term that I have seen in the papers are some of them are calling them liquid, which just applies to the fact that they can reconfigure themselves as the inputs change, which is even a better model of the brain. As I was talking about before, it's not just a digital thing, there are fields around it, and these all change. So we're getting better at representing the realities bit by bit, a bit closer. It was just clunky with just a network. Now we're doing these sorts of things. And we get to the point where, if I had to say, looking at everything, there are free technologies out there that, if I was an investor running a hedge fund or something like that, you look at that, it's the trifecta. It is AI, quantum computing, and fusion energy. The three need each other. So quantum computing, AI can be used to help, shall we say, the propagation, the management of the technology that's being used for quantum computing. It can help you on error algorithms. The main thing with quantum computer is fixing the errors. So by using the AI to help you with the quantum computing will create a completely new generation of AI.
Yeah, incredible efficiency.
Completely, it will be completely different. But at the same time, the big engineering problem with fusion is it's an engineering problem, the maths of holding the fields. So by having AI, we've improved the efficiency of the fusion we can already do. You need that. So now think about how you need lots of energy. Well, fusion will give you lots of energy. So these three things, there's this natural sort of, and I suppose it's something that happens in the world. The things that you need just happen to arise similarly.
Well, they support each other. They're probably encouraging innovation.
And they all need each other for the next generation. So again, you look at these sort of three things, oh, now there's other things too around there, but I've just simplified it that they are all feed off each other. You need the energy, but you need AI to allow you to do fusion. The best AI you can get is from quantum computing, and quantum computing is already using our current AI to help us be more efficient on that. So it's those three things.
Well, those three would also power, I mean, my personal opinion is the future of AI will be creating thinking. So not a one-to-one, because one-to-one is extremely limited. And anything from a business perspective, anything one-to-one, just it's not the thing. It's easy to sell the story in the public domain, but the things that will make real change, that will affect on an individual and a much wider basis, is the ability to think. Now, that's connected to observation, multiple inputs, but at the core of that, I think, has to be the interpretation of critical thinkers. So the human element, because the human element, if we've even seen in the world on so many different times, and it goes back thousands of years, a particular chain of thought from an individual which doesn't make sense but is convincing, doesn't necessarily and very rarely lead to good results. I mean, you could pick any horrible part of history, and that's the personification of that. Good subject matter thinking, and there are so many different real specifics. I had a chat with someone last night. His expertise is, let's say, an element of geological. He understands exactly what's happening with and the value of every part of from surface down to a significant level of the Earth's core, shall we say. And he instinctively knows how to solve a problem with machinery, what the makeup's going to be. 3 years worth of experience. Yet some consultants could go in and they'll charge you 5 million quid, and they'll have all these thoughts and ideas. But that's applicable to anything. Producing an artist is decades of experience to understand how, why, to have lived it. Same with real great educators, great people who understand building businesses and money. You could look at anything. And that mindset, I mean, Floyd is a perfect example. A former special air service, got to the point where he was training absolute elite soldiers, mentally, emotionally, physically, strategically, in all of these different ways. Well, we can all have opinions because we watched a movie and go, no, now we know everything. No. So how can we empower the right thinking and expand on scale what we understand to be great thinking, and do that to humanity's benefit?
Yes, the art of critical thinking is not taught at schools,
Which is
unfortunately. You know, they have tests and things, and you know, it's a shame, because if you don't learn it very young, if it's beaten out of you not to do it, you know, if that really handicaps the development. I mean, actually in New Zealand they did it. They taught basic philosophy, you know, from 7-year-olds in some schools, and it's not a luxury. It's that first start of critical thinking, you know, being asked to make an argument, to argue the point of what you disagree with.
Yeah.
You know, and that's the first thing. If you can't argue the other person's point, you know, not to be emotional, not to, you know, the logic, what they used to teach in rhetoric. So for some reason, the syllabus has squeezed it down to basic mechanical learning, and what universities used to teach and schools, you know, was the ability to think critically. Now, the potential for AI to allow us to bring that into schools, again, is definitely there. You know, to looking at that ability to have your own critical things about questioning. So you could have an AI agent, or you could make one that was Feynman, or you could make one that was Socrates. You know, we have this ability to mimic correctly, and that gives every student the ability to start these interactions.
And you see, that's the key point, the interactions, not something which is a gimmick, something that observes and also learns.
Yes.
So it's a two-way
It's
relationship.
responsive. And one of the patents we were working on was, we worked out that if I get a 4-year-old, I can create a 4-year-old friend, agent, I call it Virgil, and that would learn. But it would learn and grow with the child. So
at the same pace.
when it was 5, this would be 5. When it was 6, it was 6. And, you know, so we were leveraging that ability because we learn socially. And we do know at the young age, it's all about mimicry. They'll mimic. If we do that, they do that. So that's the potential that sits there. And as long as the agent is responsive, then you'll get the connection, and then the brain opens up and you can start the learning process.
Because when we discussed previously the nuances about eye contact, and you mentioned one thing which I'd never realized, and I think it's fascinating, why we have so much white around our eyes.
Yes, you know, if you look at our relatives, the primates, our cousins, the simians, and other animals, they don't have the white around it. I don't think any animals do. And what it was noted was that white allows us to look across the room, I can look at your eyes and we can see movement. It's an amazingly efficient way. And we sync our eyes, and emotions are given. We communicate with it. And having the white around our eye means we can see that eye movement at a distance. Quite a distance. It's quite surprising. It's very much like the ability we have in the brain in a crowded room of people talking. I can pick out a conversation and hear it. Which, when you look at the physics of that, how the hell are we doing it? The brain is doing. So the same thing with the eyes. So we have these abilities to pick up unique social signals, be it your conversation, your eye movement, etc. So it's a very important coupling. And so a child expects something to couple, and then the brain says, I'm ready for learning, type thing.
Which also gives another reason why certain what do you call it in the metaverse? We'll name which company it is, but the lack of arms or elbows or something.
Yeah, here's the thing. There's a thing they call uncanny, which is they found that no matter how good you try and replicate the human face, the brain is so good at representing them that even if they look real, you just naturally feel that's not right. And it's because evolutionary, we've been designed to recognize faces more than any other thing, and the brain will pick it up if it's not real, and they call it the uncanny thing, and it's a problem. But it's not a problem when you realize that you don't need to make a 100% representation of a person to be a person. We know we can go to the theatre and somebody can be an actor and they can convince me they were Winston Churchill, or I can sit there saying that's Julius Caesar being murdered, So we are far more comfortable using the hardware of our brain to fill in the gaps rather than try and represent a complete 100% Julius Caesar in front of me. So that if that person is able to give up certain characteristics, the things that convince me that that's Julius Caesar, my brain will fill in all the rest. So it's combining, their hardware, making an image, with my own processing power. And if I'm clever enough to be able to trigger what that requires, it will fill in the gaps.
So that's effectively the subconscious processing. Yeah. So if we again look at the future of where, and I'll use the term artificial intelligence as in replicating our intelligence, the subconscious processing, and in real time, because I know that we don't really think about it, but if you look at anything from a distance, the only thing your eyes focused on is the size of a small postage stamp. It's incredibly finite, and it's almost like your brain subconsciously processes all the surroundings and the distance and everything else, but our actual focal point of vision is minuscule.
Yeah, it's that thing where I mentioned the brain makes a model because it's got to save its energy and processing power. So it's going, all right, that's a room, it's not going to change. I'm going to presume that that looks bigger up there, so it's closer to me than that, which is smaller. Sometimes we get it wrong, and that's why you have, those funny things.
Well, I find if you wear a baseball cap and you've got things which are low hanging, just that absence of the field of vision, you can guarantee to bump your head.
Yeah, that's true, actually. Yes, right. But yeah, again, the brain has been clever, saying, okay, 9 out of 10 times we're not going to have an accident if I just presume my laws say if it's big, it's close to me. If it's small, it's far away. If they're the same things. And that's why we can fool people. And that's how we do that. But that's purely that, the principle of least action. How can I do the most with the least amount of energy? That's what we're designed for. And, the good thing is we're still here. Our ancestors would have gone, oh, I hear something in the bushes, I'm going to run away, even if most of the time it wasn't a saber-toothed tiger, but every now and again it was.
Yeah.
And that took you out of the evolutionary pool. So we learnt these things very early, these approximations, even though they can get things wrong, overall they've led to an advantage.
Yeah. So, last question or last thought. What do you see the future of AI being?
I think moving to the next play, I mean, there are some people who say AI won't, well, true artificial intelligence will have to have consciousness. There's a whole, I'm not going to get into that conversation because I can see merit in it, but it's way outside my area and I have difficulty understanding what consciousness is. But there is a field where people say, well, if it's truly going to be that. The other thing is, I mentioned the word emotions, which it's something that is part of our intelligent process. There's no doubt about it. You can't separate it out. Intelligence is not pure logic.
Yeah.
So therefore, it must be something else, right? So algorithms, which are purely logical, will not by themselves, in my opinion, produce what I would consider intelligence. Now, how do you represent emotions, etc.? But I feel that will need to be a component of it. So I'm not going as far as saying it's got to be self-aware and conscious. There's a whole group. I'm saying if we can combine that messiness of emotions, that allows us to stretch outside the logical progression.
That makes sense. It seems at the moment people believe a charcoal drawing is fine art, and they're yet to pick up oil paints.
Yeah, no, it's not to say it's not useful. Like I think I mentioned before that even though the large language models, in my opinion, are not what I consider artificial intelligence, they're exceptionally useful.
I agree.
Because so much of the work we do requires so little of our brain. And so it is still a useful tool, but not to misuse it or expect it to be that next thing. As we add what we mentioned, liquid neural networks, those networks that change dynamically and reconfigure and mimic the brain one dimension even closer. That's the next step. And then after that, that next step might be how do we add emotions to that thing. So in a sense, our models are getting representing more parts of the brain as you go along. So the next one is liquid reconfiguring, pruning things. I think the next step after that, I don't know how to do it, but that emotional connectivity. And it might be social. We know our intelligence grew up by having multiples of us having to communicate. So maybe it requires separate ones that are communicating, to create that same sort of environment where you have multiple intelligence as individuals that are able to interact in a loosely coupled way, but not directly, and see what happens. So networking those networks, in a sense.
Yeah. I think from our perspective, we see first describe everything, have that ability, and upon that ability, there are many functions and many capabilities can be born in the future, could be understood now, and can make use of capabilities, but without an overarching ability to observe and understand the world in which we live in, all things could potentially be flawed because they are not considering the replication of what human intelligence is as such.
Yeah, I mean, I'll use the physics analogy for when you model something, you go, okay, this thing interacts with this thing, and there's the rest of the universe. And mathematically, you don't ignore it, or they don't teach it, but really you couple it to the rest of the universe to observe it, and it is actually taken into account. And it's like us, we are part of this room and everything, and that it needs to be taken into account.
I agree.
And in physics, you do it as a heat sink, or it's a term out there, and that's it's it. But we're coupled to it, and we're part of that. So yes, the more inputs we can put onto it, the more likely we are to be able to develop something that at least mimics our intelligence or whatever, or create a monster.
One or the other.
Yeah, but
On
no, interesting times.
that note, it's been an absolute pleasure.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank
you,
you.
Robert.